The dining room smelled of rosemary, chicken, and the faint citrus candle Sophie always lit when guests came over. I had brought a peach cobbler from a bakery in Greenville, still warm under the foil, but it sat untouched at the far end of the counter while Sophie held court at the table. She was dressed in a silk blouse the color of champagne, explaining how a brand she worked with had just closed a deal worth 6 figures. Ethan leaned back in his chair, beaming as though he had negotiated it himself. Their friends and a couple of Sophie's colleagues nodded along, impressed. I folded my napkin on my lap, listening, reminding myself that it was her birthday, and the evening was meant for celebration. Then Ethan chuckled, shaking his head with the kind of pride that had once been reserved for school report cards. "You'll never be as good as my wife," he said, his voice carrying over the table. Laughter broke out. Sophie's high, triumphant laugh, the polite chuckles of others eager to stay in the glow. I felt the air leave my lungs, though I kept my face still. I looked at Ethan, my son, the boy I had once rocked to sleep in a one-bedroom apartment after long shifts at the school. He didn't glance at me. He was too busy basking in the moment, the hero in his wife's story. I lowered my eyes to the tablecloth, tracing the faint pattern of vines stitched along its edge, and tried to swallow down the sting. The words settled heavy in my chest, the kind of weight that doesn't lift with polite smiles. On the drive home that night, I thought of another table, another moment years earlier, when everything had changed. The sting of Ethan's words carried me back to Greenville, not just on the highway, but through years I thought I had buried under routine. I saw myself at 30, standing in our kitchen with the phone pressed to my ear, listening to the mill managers stumble through the words that made me a widow. Ethan had been 6'2", young to understand why his father's boots sat by the door but never moved. Again, I remember how small his hand felt in mine the day we walked into Greenville Middle, where I asked the principal for every hour of work they could give me. By that fall, I was keeping attendance in the mornings, filing records in the afternoons, and shelving books in the evenings. At night, when Ethan was asleep, I balanced the bills at the kitchen table, circling numbers with a pencil that left smudges on my fingers. We scraped by secondhand coats, bargain groceries, summers without air conditioning. Yet somehow by the time he graduated high school, there was enough tucked away to send him to UNC Charlotte. I can still see him on Movian Day, grinning beside a stack of boxes, his whole life ahead of him. I told myself the exhaustion had been worth it. When he wanted a condo a few years later, I pulled $5,000 from the envelope I'd been saving for a new roof and handed it over. He promised to pay it back, but promises fade quickly in busy lives. I didn't chase it. I only wanted to see him steady, secure. What I never expected was how quickly a mother could turn invisible once another woman began to shine in his world. By the time Sophie entered Ethan's life, I had grown used to standing in the background. At first, I welcomed her. She was bright, charming, and spoke with the confidence of someone who believed the world would always tilt her way. Ethan lit up around her, and I thought maybe that light would spill into the rest of our family. It didn't take long for the stories to spread. At church gatherings in Greenville or dinners with relatives in Charlotte, people spoke of Sophie as though she were the answer to a prayer. She was ambitious, stylish, the kind of woman others pointed to with admiration. Online, she wrote about hustle and discipline, painting herself as self-made, a woman who had built her success from grit alone. The comments applauded her, and Ethan basked in the glow. What no one saw were the grocery bags I carried up their townhouse stairs. When their fridge sat empty after one of Sophie's big launches. They didn't see the Saturdays I spent babysitting so she could travel to networking events, or the quiet transfers I made when Ethan admitted a bill had slipped through. None of those details made it into her curated feeds. I told myself it didn't matter, that mothers are meant to help to fill in the gaps. But each time Sophie posted a photo of herself with Ethan's arm around her, captioned with words about independence and building an empire, a quiet ache settled deeper in my chest. I wasn't jealous of her success. I was invisible in its shadow. Still, I kept showing up with groceries, with childcare, with quiet support, believing that one day Ethan would notice who was keeping the seams of his life stitched together. But instead, the distance between us grew wider, and soon my silence would begin to feel like complicity. One night, not long after that birthday dinner, I sat at my kitchen table with a stack of bank statements spread before me. It started as an attempt to reassure myself that I wasn't imagining things, that the drain I felt each month had a number attached to it. What began as a handful of highlighted lines turned into a ledger that stretched across 12 years. There was the $220 I wired when Ethan's power bill came due during his first year in Charlotte, the $600 for Sophie's car repairs when she clipped to curb, the $480 for new tires after Ethan's old set went bald, mortgage payments I quietly covered when Ethan said a client check was running late, groceries, gas money, surprise child care when Sophie's schedule demanded another trip out of state. None of it recorded anywhere, except in the margins of my own life. When I added it together, the total came to nearly $42,000. I stared at the number as though it belonged to someone else's account. $42,000. That was the kitchen remodel I had postponed 3 times. That was the roof repair still waiting on a contractor. That was the trip I once promised myself to the coast of Maine, shelved year after year because someone else's needs shouted louder. But the number only told half the story. What couldn't be tallied were the Saturdays spent babysitting, while Sophie filmed content, the afternoons rearranging my doctor's appointments to drive Ethan to the mechanic, the evenings watching their children while they posted smiling photos from events I was never invited to. Those hours lived nowhere but in my memory, a quiet currency that left me more depleted than any transfer ever could. I closed the folder and pressed my hands flat against the table. It felt less like evidence and more like a diary. 12 years of giving without acknowledgement, proof of how easy it had become for them to lean while I carried. I didn't know it then, but that ledger would soon leave the shadows of my kitchen drawer and step into the light of their dining room. South Park's lights glowed soft against the glass windows of the restaurant as I walked in, carrying a wrapped box. Inside was a quilt I'd worked on for months, deep blues and silvers stitched together in a pattern that reminded me of waves. I had chosen it because Sophie once mentioned wanting something to drape across the guest room bed, and I thought maybe this gift made with my hands would find a place in her home. The table was already buzzing when I arrived. Sophie leaned close to Ethan, her wrist tilted to catch the light. A silver bracelet sparkled under the chandelier. Ethan surprised me with this, she said, voice carrying just enough to be heard by everyone around her. He really does know how to spoil me. She brushed a kiss against his cheek, and the table erupted in admiration. I kept my smile steady, though I knew exactly where part of that surprise had come from. Just 2 weeks earlier, Ethan had called asking if I could help cover an unexpected expense. He never said what it was for, and I hadn't asked. Now I saw the answer glittering on Sophie's arm. When it came time for gifts, my box was passed over quickly. Sophie pulled back the tissue paper, glanced at the quilt, and offered a polite thank you before setting it aside. Conversation swelled again around the bracelet around Ethan's thoughtfulness, as though my hours of work were nothing more than background noise. And then Ethan chuckled the same sound I'd heard at the last dinner and repeated it like a practice line. "You'll never be as good as my wife." The table laughed with him. Sophie, most of all, I felt the air tighten around me, the weight of years pressing down, and in that moment, I knew something inside me had begun to shift, something that would not be silenced much longer. The morning after Sophie's birthday, I sat at my kitchen table with the quilt scraps still scattered across the chair beside me. My hands moved on their own, pulling open my laptop, logging into my bank account, scrolling through years of transactions. The numbers told a story, louder than any words I could have spoken at that dinner. I printed the records one by one, the machine humming steadily as page after page slid into the tray. Transfers labeled utilities, mortgage, groceries stacked in a neat pile. I pulled receipts from drawers, notes scribbled on scraps of paper, even text messages where Ethan had asked, "Just this once, can you spot me?" By noon, I had nearly a binder worth of evidence, a silent chronicle of 12 years, written in dollar signs. At first, I thought the act would break me, but it steadied me instead. For the first time in years, I could see my life in black and white, the shape of sacrifice laid bare. This wasn't pettiness. It was proof. That afternoon, I opened the banking app again, not to send, but to stop. 2 automatic transfers, one set for their utilities, another for the mortgage cushion, were canceled with a few taps of my finger. The screen asked if I was sure. I pressed yes, and a kind of quiet spread through me, heavier than relief, sharper than fear. I slid the papers into a plain binder from the dollar store, its cover thin and unremarkable, but what it held carried the weight of years I could no longer ignore. I placed it on the counter where it sat like a promise waiting to be spoken. And with every glance at that binder, I felt the silence inside me turn into something closer to resolve, carrying me toward the Sunday I knew was coming. That Sunday, I set the table in Greenville, as I had 100 times before. Roast chicken, green beans, mashed potatoes. It looked like every family dinner I had ever hosted, but the binder sat beneath the sideboard waiting. Ethan and Sophie arrived late, Sophie sweeping in with a laugh about traffic, Ethan following with a bottle of wine. They settled quickly, confident the rhythm would be the same as always. I would feed them. I would listen. And before the evening ended, some quiet request would slip into the conversation. Sure enough, halfway through the meal, Ethan sighed, glanced at Sophie, and said, "We've been talking about expenses. Things are tight right now. Maybe you could help us cover the gap this month." I wiped my hands on the napkin, stood and brought the binder to the table. I set it down between the serving bowls, its weight louder than any word. "Before we talk about this month," I said, "we need to talk about the last 12 years. Ethan frowned. Sophie tilted her head, amused at first, until I opened the binder. Pages of transfers, receipts, highlighted notes spread out in front of them. "What is this?" Ethan asked. "Proof," I said. "Utilities, car repairs, mortgage, payments, groceries, everything you've leaned on me for since you left home." Sophie laughed, brittle and sharp. "This is ridiculous. Families help each other. You make it sound like a bill. Ethan leaned back, shaking his head. Mom, we never asked for all this. You just wanted to help. I met his eyes. No, you asked again and again, and I gave until it hollowed me out. His face tightened, the easy charm gone. So what now? You want me to thank you to admit Sophie isn't as capable as you. The words stung, but my voice stayed steady. You said I'd never be as good as your wife. Fine, then tell her to handle everything, because I'm done picking up the pieces. The room went silent. Sophie's smile slipped. Ethan's face turned pale. For once there was no easy joke, no dismissive shrug to erase what had been laid bare. I closed the binder, slid it back across the table, and felt the quiet settle differently this time, not as a weight pressing me down, but as a space finally cleared. And in that space, the fallout began. By the time the dishes from that Sunday dinner were stacked in my sink, my phone was already buzzing. At first, it was Ethan. One call after another, his name lighting up the screen until I silenced it. Then came Sophie, her messages sharp and fast. I can't believe you embarrassed us like that. You've always resented me. I set the phone face down, but it kept trembling across the counter. The next morning, Aunt Joyce called. She didn't bother with hello. Marin, what on earth were you thinking? Families aren't ledgers. You should have kept those numbers to yourself. Now you've made Ethan feel small. I let her words wash over me. The same lecture I'd heard in different forms for years. But this time, I didn't apologize. I simply said, I'm tired of being invisible. She sighed, the way people do when they've decided you're hopeless, and hung up without goodbye. On Facebook, Sophie crafted her version. A photo of her and Ethan smiling over brunch captioned, some people will try to tear you down when they see you thriving, but love always wins. The comments poured in. Hearts, prayers, little notes praising her strength. I scrolled once, then closed the app for good. That week, Ethan sent a Venmo request for $400, labeled rent. In the past, I would have clicked without hesitation, but instead, I opened my savings app. I created a new transfer set for the same day each month, the same amount I once sent him. This time, it went into an account with only my name on it. Watching the confirmation screen glow back at me felt like reclaiming air I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The house was quiet that night, quieter than I liked. The ache of distance sat beside me on the couch, heavy as a stone. But alongside, it was something else, something that felt almost like relief. For the first time in years, I knew the money I earned and the hours I worked belonged to me alone. It was a small beginning, fragile and uncertain, but it was mine. And as the days stretched on, I began to see how different a life could look when you no longer lived it as someone else's safety net. In the weeks that followed, I began to notice how different my days felt when they were no longer shaped around someone else's emergencies. The first Sunday after I canceled Ethan's transfer, I drove to the library and signed up for a book club, sitting among strangers talking about stories that had nothing to do with family obligations. I felt a quiet spark I hadn't felt in years. At church, I stopped rushing out after service. Instead, I stayed for the potluck suppers, sharing casseroles and peach pies, laughing at small-town gossip. People asked me about myself, not about Ethan or Sophie. And I realized how rare it had been to speak without their names shadowing every sentence. With the savings beginning to build, I hired a carpenter to finally fix the porch railing that had been loose for nearly a decade. Watching him Set the new post sturdy and straight. Felt symbolic, as though the house and I were both finding our footing again.
I
Even bought a rocking chair for the porch, the kind I used to imagine sitting in when I was younger.
each
Evening I rocked as the sun set, listening to SOPHIA'S sing while the air
cooled.
I allowed myself small indulgences too. A good cut of salmon at the market, a bottle of wine not on
Sale.
a pair of walking shoes that didn't pinch. They were simple things, but they felt like declarations. Of course, I missed Ethan. Some mornings I caught myself expecting his call, even if it was just another
Request.
The silence between us was painful, but the peace that filled its place was undeniable. It was in that stillness that I began to see what kind of future I wanted, and what I would know longer, except it was nearly 4 months before Ethan came to Greenville.
I saw
His car pull into the driveway late one Saturday afternoon, headlights cutting across the porch where I sat with my book. He stepped out alone, no Sophie at his side, and for the first time in years he looked less like the confident man he projected, and more like the boy I remembered leaving for college. We sat at the kitchen table in the same chairs we had used for countless meals.
he
Didn't reach for food or small talk. Instead, he looked at the binder on the counter, the same one I had left in plain sight. I read through it, he said quietly. Every page. I can't say I didn't know you always helped, but I didn't realize how much. Or maybe I didn't want to realize. I listened, my hands folded in my lap. He rubbed at the back of his neck, the words coming unevenly. Sophie says you're trying to drive a wedge between us. But when I saw those numbers, I couldn't argue.
you
Carried us. I don't know how to make that right. You don't need to make it right, I said.
My voice was steady even.
You need to understand it can't continue. I am your mother, not your
Bank.
If you want me in your life, it must be for love, not what I cover. His eyes dropped to the table. He nodded once, then stood as though the weight of the conversation had left him heavier. At the door, he hesitated like he wanted to say more, but nothing came. He walked out into the fading light, uncertain, leaving both of us in the quiet he
Couldn't break.
I rose, closed the binder, and placed it back in the
Drawer.
It wasn't a trophy, and it wasn't revenge. It was a record, and now it was done. For the first time, I felt the boundary I had drawn settle into place, not as anger, but as dignity.
And
As the evening air cooled through the open window, I knew I had chosen a future that belonged to